It's a pleasure to be here this morning. Just by way of introduction, as Dig said, I've been with the company for some time now, leading the EMEA and Latin America region. It's the most wonderful, frustrating, dynamic, and exciting region in the world, and that's for the benefit of my Asia-Pacific colleagues in the room. And I got the opportunity today to share a bit of background about the business, about the challenges and opportunities of that region. Before joining Cochlear, just by way of introduction, I've got a background in cardiology and critical care therapies, but obviously for the past 15 years, I've had the privilege to be part of the executive team of Cochlear leading this region. As EMEA is defined, the EMEA region is 73 countries, and that covers about 35% of the world's population, which is quite a mix of economies, both developed and emerging markets. And in the last financial year, that's approximately 35% of our Cochlear's global revenue comes from the EMEA region. And as you can see on the graph on the right, we've been very pleased to deliver consistent growth over the past years. That comes from a mix of geographies and portfolio that is obviously behind that figure. And indeed, as we look at the organization, what you've seen globally in Cochlear's development, which Dig has referred to this morning, has indeed been reflected in the growth of the business and the development of the organization across EMEA. As Cochlear has pioneered this therapy globally, so it has across the EMEA region through the 1980s and 1990s in particular, building on that research and relationships of Professor Graham Clark's work from which Cochlear emerged. And indeed, the funding path has initially followed, as Diggs described it, initially through pediatrics, and charity funding in many countries has been the stimulus before government reimbursement has taken over in developed markets. And then adults and seniors has become an increasingly important part of our business, as I'll share with you in a second. The initial footprint of Cochlear across the region has been in the two significant markets. Our first offices were in Germany and in the UK. So that was a start, and today we have direct presence across the majority of Western Europe with a number of affiliates now established, in particular through the period from 2005 onwards, when we took the strategic decision to take control of our business in those established markets and get direct relationships with funders, with KOLs, and with patients more than in other markets. So today we're direct in the majority of Western Europe with an organization of around 550 people in that geography. And that is in addition to the bone conduction, the CBAS business unit based out of Gothenburg, and the part of the R&D organization based out of Mechelen in Belgium, which Jan just referred to this morning. Importantly, we have a very big network of well-established and very credible distributors throughout the Middle East and Central and Eastern Europe. It's very much our strategy to see them as an extension of the company. It's important that we have professional and informed and educated partners as who we are. And indeed, as we look at those regions, we took the decision to open offices in Dubai for the Middle East and Vienna for the Central and Eastern Europe region in order to provide continuing education support for patients, for distributors, and for clinicians in those regions. And I'll cover those points towards the end of this presentation. As a European, the fact that the bone conduction technology came out of Sweden is a matter of particular pride, and indeed it's a significant presence in the organization that was added through the acquisition in 2005 of the Entific organization based out of Sweden. I mentioned about the different markets that is made up of EMEA, or makes up EMEA, and so if I somewhat crudely, but nevertheless appropriately talk about developed and emerging markets. You can see there, this is an annual picture of the proportion of surgeries that are registered for children and for adults and seniors. That's a bit of a static view, but it's safe to say that the adults and seniors is growing as a proportion of our business, particularly in those developed markets. And that reflects the broad general market demographics of an aging population in Western Europe, where CI is increasingly known and funded as a treatment, and following the establishment of standard of care for newborns in the majority of Western European markets. Now that percentage that Dig referred to of over 60% penetration comes from those economies. And indeed, the funding mechanisms are far more well established, more regular funding established in those Western European markets. And the challenges there are more around awareness or driving awareness and overcoming the obstacles to referral and access, rather than just purely establishment of the therapy. With regard to the emerging markets, by way of contrast, that pattern of initial funding going towards children continues in these markets. Also, don't forget the dynamics of those populations, particularly in the Middle East. Very young populations, high birth rates, means that that is a government priority to bring funding and extend healthcare towards the general population, starting with pediatrics. We don't believe that particular mix is going to change dramatically in the short to medium term. There's much more to be done with the pediatrics, and indeed, implantation rates today are well behind even the incidence, the annual incidence of deaf-born children in these markets. I'll just make some brief reflections on the developed markets, a few more further comments. For healthcare systems, the funding mechanisms and the indications do vary across Western Europe, but I think in general, the establishment or the funding has been established for both CI and bone conduction across those economies. There's only a small number of private healthcare funded implants that we have in our business today, both for CI and for BAHA. And again, in the short to medium term, whilst we look at pilots in those fields, we don't today forecast that to become a significant part of the business, given the dynamics of those markets. There are, of course, funding caps and different mechanisms of capitation, particularly across Western Europe, that exist across those countries, and most of our time and investment on market access initiatives is indeed focused on addressing how do we bring more people through the chain of referral so that they can get treated in an informed and cost-effective way. With regard to indications, there are a growing number of implantations for asymmetric or single-sided deafness that we start to see in cochlear implantation, and that's probably been a bigger part of the bone conduction world until now, but increasingly we start to see that trend, and beginning is the funding for adult bilaterals in some of these markets, and that's something which we continue to focus and raise awareness on the benefits of sequential and indeed simultaneous adult bilateral implantation. For children, it's a different story. Bilateral CI implantations are reasonably well funded now in the majority of countries in the developed markets, and indeed for BAHA also, for the indications both across single-sided, conductive, and mixed hearing loss, that is reasonably well established. A couple of comments just on the UK and Germany to bring some of those points to life. You can see here for the UK markets, this was one of the markets which had some very early development of this therapy through the 1980s, building on the work of Graham Clark. And today we have around 22 clinics that cover the whole population of the UK and Ireland, and approximately 135 clinics also doing BAHA or bone conduction implants across the region. Both those therapies are funded and supported by NICE assessments. That's very important in the equation of health economics and effectiveness. And indeed, if you look at the impact that such a recommendation has had on the market for bilateral implantations for children, following the recommendation from NICE in 2009, those are fundamentally important studies and justifications or recommendations that these type of institutes, in this case NICE for the UK, bring to these therapeutic areas. Indeed, DIG, I think, referred to the current indications in the UK being quite conservative, and we are quite hopeful that the current review of indications will lead to a broadening, we hope, of the recommendations in the coming months. We will see. As you can imagine, from a company investment perspective, our initiatives and our focus on a range of initiatives to drive awareness and access through this market. We are investing in the so-called direct-to-consumer campaigns, trying to raise awareness through a range of offline and online initiatives for our therapies. We talk about Cochlear care programs, where we work with clinics to relieve them from the administrative burden of a growing base of patients. How can we do that in order to free up capacity for continued treatment of new patients? That's an important part of the Cochlear care programs with clinics in the UK. I think we've spoken here at Investor Days about a Cochlear family, a scheme whereby we connect with patients to keep them educated and informed about developments in this field. And that is a big part of what we do in the UK. And of course, as we bring to market the new technology around Nucleus 7 and BAHA 5 most recently, that's the UK market is indeed one of the early adopters of the markets in which we take that new technology quite quickly to market as we come through the product development cycle. If you look here, just an example of where we spend time and attention on connecting with candidates and their families and raising awareness. The initial aim of these investments is not so much to just sort of send a product catalog or technology communication to patients and families. It's more about educating, informing, and engaging with people looking for solutions past the point of hearing aids. And indeed, I think we're becoming increasingly connected with patients through understanding what they want and to put them in touch with professionals, with other volunteers, perhaps other patients. Those are very powerful relationships that we can foster through in this case, the online connections, and developing material to guide people, inform them, and educate them of the options and of the possibilities of outcomes from treatment for cochlear implants and for bone conduction. If I just turn towards Germany, this is a slightly different graph that you see here with a higher proportion of adults and seniors, and indeed that reflects both the size of the markets and the the growth and the earlier adoption and the broader indications in this market, which has led to about 3/4 of our business there, 75% of our business in the last year coming from surgeries registered for adults and seniors. A long history in this market, the first implantation back from the early 1980s in MHH in Hanover, which remains, I think, the largest implanting clinic in the country. There's now about 85 clinics that cover that geography, very significant number of clinics. And the reimbursement mechanisms are reasonably well established. DRG for the initial implantations, that scheme is well understood, with aligned budgets for rehabilitation upgrades, very important part of our business in this geography. The indications are reasonably broad, and indeed that early adoption, not only from medical reimbursement law, but also from social law, has driven this growth of the market, so that you see this adults and seniors becoming an increasing number and proportion of the market overall. We've invested importantly in building our teams, our field presence in this country over the last years, a mixture of technical, clinical, and patient-skilled people, or patient support people, an important mix across the regional structure, which we continue to invest in today, but certainly we've added to over the past 2 to 3 years, quite importantly. Our focus, again, is on raising awareness, continuing to raise awareness, because with those indications and that platform of opportunity of 85 clinics, it has to be around bringing those patients through the referral channels, through this mix of online and offline initiatives. And I've just mentioned already the importance of the upgrade business in Germany is quite significant. That patient base has become a well-funded opportunity for patients to get better technology, better outcomes, funded through the public healthcare system. If we look at examples, we sometimes have to be careful not to give the impression that all we do is online. The world of print remains quite a valuable connection opportunity to families and candidates, and indeed this is just one example, just going through on the right, the pharmacy opportunity, where there's a magazine in the pharmacy, which is probably one of our most successful connection tools back into the community of families and patients, where covering the whole of the country, we can focus our time, investment, and energies on print material just as much as on the online world. So quite a sophisticated mix of initiatives there to continue to raise and drive awareness of the therapies. Naturally, the online world is a complement, and they're complements to each other, and we use the whole range of search engine optimization and the social media, the online tools, and indeed the tools of Salesforce and Marketo in order to better refine and connect with patients and families in the wider community of Germany. If I just turn and pivot to talk a little bit about the emerging markets, part of EMEA, and that's the Middle East and Africa and the Central and Eastern Europe business. I think there are some commonalities across these two regions, and that indeed starts with the common government focus on expanding access to healthcare for the populations. I think there is an increasing awareness and funding of these therapies, but it's a tricky one for forecasting the outcomes of tenders as we go through the region. And indeed, I think my lifetime work is to educate my finance colleagues that a forecast is a forecast, it's not a guarantee. And that's a work in progress. And we'll continue. But the cochlear implantation rates, again, I think I mentioned it before for the Middle East, remain well below the annual incidence of death-born. And whilst the markets are growing, this inconsistency and unpredictability of timing can obviously be a challenge for us as we look at our investment cycles. Importantly, it's not all about a single sale. I think if you look at the success of developed markets and the businesses that have grown up over time, it's very important that we look at investments that build the post-operative infrastructure, not just look at a single tender for a single sale. Because if this therapy is to establish itself and be funded consistently in the future by these governments, it has to have the infrastructure around audiology and speech and language therapy and rehabilitation, which we view as an important part of the equation of what we aim to do in these countries. The final point perhaps is a generic point, but it's one which we passionately believe in, that distributors are an extension of you as a company. And when you get back on that plane and you leave that country, you need to make sure that that distributor is fully equipped and competent and trained to represent you in the long term, to develop that market, to put those infrastructures in place, supported by Cochlear in terms of our skills and our people. Sometimes in market, we might actually operate in a slightly mixed way of having our clinical experts in the market while the distributor covers the commercial side of business. That market or that model sometimes works in the larger markets, and that's an important part of the business. A couple of comments just on the Middle East and Africa. We put our office into Dubai as a range of skills to support the distributors, to support the patients on occasion, but most importantly to support the clinics and the clinicians as this therapy is built. And there is, of course, I think, some challenges of funding and an infrastructure which are unique by market. It's not as if these are virgin territories. A lot of the professionals in these markets have been involved in the development of cochlear implantation from the 1990s, for example. But what is immature is the funding and the infrastructure in these markets from a government perspective, which remains critical today to build this business. I won't read every bullet point here. I'm just reinforcing here this significance of tenders. And it's important, I think, not to just be thinking of tender as a singularity. Tenders can take many shapes and forms. They can be framework tenders, they can be regional, they can be national. And indeed, understanding that and also working towards the specifications of benefit through the tenders is an important part of what we do and what the management team focuses on across the region with distributors. Importantly, I think the acoustics interest continues to rise, and that's both the bone conduction portfolio and the Carina, which I think we just touched on earlier this morning. And just on the right there at the bottom, you can see some of the work that goes into training and education through the Cochlear Academy in Dubai. The middle is a patient event, and up at the top, for those of you perhaps closer to the screen, you can see Brett Lee, who's the Global Hearing Ambassador. This was an occasion that we had Brett in Dubai with NBC, which is the largest TV channel across the Middle East. And these kind of initiatives are enormously important to just raise awareness of the benefit of healthy hearing, forget even the technology to start with. So a whole range of activities across the Middle East and Africa. In some ways, the Central and Eastern Europe region mimics what I've just talked about, and indeed the structure of the organization in opening an office in Vienna to support distributors, to support clinicians and patients is indeed the same intent and the same structure in this region. It's safe to say, I think the awareness continues to grow quite nicely in this region. It could be faster, of course, but what's quite striking is that patient groups increasingly have a voice in the communication to funders and to reimbursers. And that's something that we see in places like Hungary, places like Romania, places like Greece and Turkey. Those are very, very important relationships to foster and invest in, which we do. And indeed, again, it's more, the markets are more about a question of maturity of funding than knowledge or indeed surgical expertise, for example. You can see on the left just some examples of social media. These are patient groups and distributor forums, which we work closely with as an extension of the organization and our marketing activities there. So by way of summary, I think you can see here the focus on awareness and access for Europe, Middle East, and Africa is critical. And if you look at the developed markets, Our investments and our focus is on working to support the establishment of cochlear implants as the standard of care, to demonstrate the positive economics of treating age-related hearing loss. David Cade eloquently explained the work towards a standard of care in these markets. And indeed, there, in a related way, we've got to be able to demonstrate that functional hearing is essential to enable healthy and cost-effective aging. I've mentioned about direct-to-consumer investments and this focus on increasing referrals and bringing those patients out of the hearing aid channel through to the treatment clinics in the developed markets. And then by way of slight contrast for the emerging markets, very much about building awareness in the general community, in the medical community as well, through a mix of public education, social media, and support of hearing screening as a foundation for any therapy. Expansion of funding is an obvious priority for us, and to highlight the compelling health economics, particularly in pediatrics. Our presence, we have opportunities to, as I mentioned before, to put Cochlear clinical people into markets to complement distributor presence across their markets, and to continue to invest in that training and development of related professions as well as surgery, but into audiology, speech therapy, etc. And then the final point here, and I forget which of my colleagues this morning mentioned the need to tier our products and our service offerings so that we can bring to market both an economically viable range of products and services for the funders, as well as the best possible outcomes for patients. My final slide, I just wanted to actually follow on from something that David also touched on about the importance of policy. And in this case, the WHO, and last May, I think the World Health Assembly, which is the policy-making body of the WHO, adopted for the first time in 22 years this resolution on the prevention of deafness and hearing loss. And sometimes if you listen to the news, you think the WHO is all about some crazy country in the middle of an ocean somewhere. But this is really quite special and important. And it touches not only on emerging markets, but also on developed markets, bringing to the table, if you like, the voice of hearing at the policymaking's table for the first time. So this is something which very much complements and guides the interactions in developed markets as well as emerging markets. So I just wanted to end on that point and reinforce some of the points that David was making as we look towards establishing these treatments as a true standard of care and the opportunity to help more people hear and be heard. So thank you. I'll hand back to Dick.